Section 9 of Mother Earth, Volume Number 1, March 1906. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill Moseley. Mother Earth, Volume 1, Number 1, March 1906. Section 9, Comstockery, by John R. Coryell. Be it understood that the shocking thing we know as Comstockery goes back into the centuries for its origin, being indeed the perfect flower of that asceticism which was engrafted on the degraded Christianity which took its name from Christ, without in the least comprehending the spirit of his lofty conception. The man Comstock, who has the shameful distinction of having lent his name to the idea of which he is the willing and probably the fit exponent, may be dismissed without further consideration, since he is, after all, only the inevitable as he is the deplorable result of that for which he stands, seemingly without any sense of the shame and the awfulness of it. It may be said, too, in dismissing him, that it is of no consequence whether the very unpleasant stories current concerning him are true or not. It is altogether probable that a man who stands for what he does, and who glories in proclaiming the things he does, will also do things for which he does not stand, and which he does not proclaim. That is a characteristic of most of us, and only proves that, after all, he is not less than human. The only point that need be made in regard to the man who is proud of representing Comstockery is, that if he had not done so, some other lost soul would. In that sad stage of our social growth when death was the penalty for most infractions of the law, an executioner could always be found who took pride in his work, and who seemed to be beyond the reach of the scorn, the abhorrence, and the contempt of his fellows. Comstockery, as we know it, is apparently an organized effort to regulate the morals of the people. If it were nothing more than this, it would be absurd and negligible, because futile, for what we call morals are only the observances which the conditions of life impose upon a people, and an act depends, for its moral status, upon its relation to those conditions. As, for example, horse stealing in a closely settled community, which has its railroads and other means of communication, is a crime to be punished by a brief period of imprisonment, while in the sparsely settled sections of a country, where the horse is an imperative necessity of life, its theft becomes a hanging matter, whatever the written law for that section of the country may be as to the punishment of the crime. And men brought up in law-abiding communities in the deepest respect for the law will, under the changed conditions of life, not merely condone the infliction of a penalty in excess of that provided by law, but will themselves assist, virtuously satisfied with their conduct because the society of which they form a part has decided that horse stealing shall be so punished. On the other hand, there are numerous laws on the statute books, still unrepealed and unenforceable because the acts treated of are no longer held to be offenses against morality. In other words, the morals of a people can be regulated only by themselves. What Comstockery does is bad enough, but its real awfulness lies in the fact that it seems to fairly enough represent us in our attitude toward a certain class of ideas and things. It is the expression of our essential immorality, using that word in its conventional sense, having its roots deep down in pruriency, hypocrisy, and ignorance. Like the blush on the cheek of the courtesan, it deceives no one, but is none the less a truthful expression, not of the thing it simulates, but of the character of the simulator. Comstockery was probably brought to this country by the first Anglo-Saxon, whether pirate or minister of the gospel, who set foot on this soil. Certainly it was a finely blooming plant on the Mayflower, and was soon blossoming here as never elsewhere in the world, giving out such a fragrance that the peculiar odor of it has become a characteristic of this land of liberty. When the so-called Comstock laws were passed, there was a real disease to be treated. The symptoms of the disease were obscene books and pictures which were being freely circulated among the children of the land, boarding schools, whether for girls or boys, being fairly flooded with the pernicious literature. The work of confiscation, suppression, and of imprisonment was done thoroughly and conscientiously, so that in the course of a comparatively short time it was difficult to find books or pictures of the kind in question. It is said that the effectiveness of the work done is best shown by the one or more libraries of obscene books which the Society or some of its officers have collected. The value of the work done and the efficiency of the workers were recognized in the passage from time to time of laws giving extraordinary powers not alone to the popularly so-called Comstock Society, but to officers of the government. A perfect fury of purity took possession of our legislators. They were determined to stamp out impurity, and perhaps they were establishing reputations for themselves. It is recorded that in the days of the Inquisition, men established their orthodoxy by the loudness of their cries against heresy, that in the times of the French Revolution, men proved their patriotism by making charges of treason against their neighbors, that practicing polygamists have purified themselves by hounding a theoretical polygamist out of their legislative body. Anyhow, the laws were passed, the thing was done. And what was the thing that was done? A moral inquisition had been established. Arguing from a wrong premise, a hideous conclusion had been reached. It was voiced only a few weeks ago by an official of the post office in Chicago, when confiscating a publication. He said in substance, if not literally, any discussion of sex is obscene. There it is in a few words, a complete and perfect treatise on Comstockery. In the early days, in some parts of New England, a man might not kiss his wife on a Sunday. On common days the filthy act was permissible, but the Sabbath must not be so defiled. And now any discussion of sex is obscenity. Pause a while and consider what this means and whither it will lead, where it has already led. Discussion of sex is obscene, then sex itself must be obscene. Life and all that pertains to it must be filthy. That is, providing it be the life of man. The sex of flowers may be discussed frankly and freely, either for the pleasure of knowledge or in order to use knowledge for the purpose of improving the flower. The sex of animals may be discussed. It is discussed in government publications and in the many farm journals published throughout the country, because it is necessary to improve the breed of our domestic animals, because these animals are valuable. but discussion of the sex of man is obscene. There have been some changes in public sentiment, some changes perhaps in the gray matter on the judicial bench, since the early days in New York when Comstockery was most rampant. For what was tolerated then is not tolerated now. Some things that were judicially wrong then are judicially right now. And in this change there is hope and the promise of greater change. In those early days, a confectioner on Fulton Street sought to attract customers by exhibiting in his window a painting by a great artist. If memory serves, it was The Triumph of Charles V by Hans Mackart. Figures of nude females were in the picture, and Comstockery, established in its censorship of art and solemnity, unconscious of its appalling ignorance, but true to its fundamental pruriency, ordered the picture removed from the window. And it was removed, just as Boston, finding its bronze Bacchante immodest, rejected the brazen hussy. And now she stands on her pedestal in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, giving joy to the beholder, and not ordered down by Comstockery. Why? And why is not the whole museum purged of its nude figures? It is a puzzle not even to be solved by the theory of change in public sentiment, for it is only a few months ago that the art censor-in-chief of Comstockery saw in the window of an art dealer on Fifth Avenue a landscape in which figured several nude children discreetly wandering away from the beholder. The picture was ordered out of the window forthwith, and went. A few blocks below, on Broadway, there were then and are now exhibited in a window numerous photographs of nude children, not all of them discreet as to the way of their going. Why? Has the art censor decided that the photographs are innocuous, or that they are art? But these instances and the amazing expeditions made by the censor into the realm of literature are hardly more than ludicrous, and they can and will correct themselves. But the frightful results of Comstockery, as applied to life and to real purity, cannot be so lightly passed over. And let it not be forgotten that an indictment of Comstockery is an indictment of ourselves, for the prurient, hypocritical, degrading thing can exist not one instant after we have declared that it shall perish. It is no exaggeration to say that Comstockery is the arch enemy of society. It seeks to make hypocrisy respectable, and it would convert impurity into a basic virtue. It labels ignorance innocence. It has legislated knowledge into a crime, and it seeks its perpetuation in the degradation of an enfeebled human race. And that these are not overstatements can easily be established to the satisfaction of any reasonable mind. The most creditable work ever done by Comstockery was the practical suppression and elimination of the obscene book. But when that is said, all is said. How worse than fatuous, how absolutely fiendish that physician would be deemed who hid the signs of smallpox with paint and powder, and permitted his patient to roam at will among his fellows, unwarned even of the nature of the fell disease that was devouring his life. Nay, worse! What if the physician should have himself clothed with plenary powers, and should compel the poor wretch to refrain from making his case known after he had discovered its nature? But this is precisely what Comstockery does. the obscene book was removed from circulation. In other words, the symptom of the disease was hidden. But was anything done to eliminate the disease, or to remove its cause? On the contrary, everything possible was done to perpetuate the disease. Everything possible was done to prevent anyone who had suffered from the disease, or knew anything about it, from imparting his knowledge. For the disease was ignorance, ignorance of self, of life, of sex. And not only does Comstockery strive to perpetuate ignorance, not only does it glorify ignorance and miscall it innocence, not only does it elevate it into a virtue, but it has legislated knowledge into a crime. The offense of the book it had eliminated was not its vicious misinformation, but its use of sex as a subject. The Post Office has said that any discussion of sex is obscene, and the courts have put one noble old man of over 70 years into prison at hard labor, and have punished an aged woman physician in some other way because they sought, in all purity and right-mindedness, to help their brothers and sisters to a knowledge of themselves. It is true that, at last, there is a rift within the lute, or would it rather be called a leak in the sewer? Comstockery has not quite the standing that it once had. When it was made generally known that a post office official had said that any discussion of sex was obscene, there followed such a rattling fire of reprobation and condemnation even from many startled conventionalists, who could support the thing but could not look it in the face, that the maker of the now historic phrase was moved to deny that he had said it officially. In fact, there are many signs, most of them still small, on the distant horizon, it is true, which indicate that we are becoming alive to the fact that it is imperative that sex should be discussed. This is an age of radical ideas. Radicalism in politics, in religion, in ethics is ripe, which is only another way of saying that we are beginning to dare to think. Probably the most apparent, if not the most significant, sign of the general radicalism is the tendency to exalt the science of life to an even higher plane than that which it occupied in the days of Hellenic supremacy. We are beginning to understand that right living is a purely physical matter, and that morals are only laws of health, and if there are yet but few who dare take so radical a view of morals as that, still there are quite as few who will not admit freely that nothing can be immoral which is beneficial to the human body. Of course, it is unthinkable, even from the point of view of the most conventional of orthodox Christians, that there can be any immorality in sex, for sex in itself is absolutely a work of the deity, hence of the highest morality, if it can have any such attribute at all. As well might one give digestion a moral quality. Morality is surely a matter of personal conduct. One may say that it is immoral to eat so much as to injure one's health, but it is not a matter of record that any considerable body of persons declares the stomach to be an immoral organ, or the digestive function to be an immoral one, or any discussion of digestion immoral. Then why sex, or sex functions? It is true that Comstockery has us to designate our legs, limbs, though not at the present time with any legal penalty for not doing so. It prescribes the word stomach for polite usage, in describing that part of the body which lies subjacent to the actual stomach, anterior to the spinal column, and posterior to the abdominal wall. It forbids a visible bifurcated garment for the limbs of a female. And it does a variety of other absurd things, all going to show that in some singular fashion it has confounded acts with things, as one might call all knives immoral because a few knives had been used to do murder with. By what extraordinary process does Comstockery conjure decency into the stomach and indecency into the bowels? But how rejoiced we should be that it is no worse than indecent to speak of the receptacle of the intestines by its common name. By some hocus-pocus of which Comstockery is easily capable, it might have been obscene to speak of the digestive process or of any of the digestive organs. We might easily have been taught that digestion was a moral matter, not to be talked of, not to be studied, ignorance of which was a virtue, knowledge of which a crime. And then, under those conditions, if a person possessed of a little knowledge such as might have crept stealthily down the ages, were in a fine humanitarian spirit to dare to publish some of the things he knew, in order to help dyspeptic humanity, he would have been robbed of his worldly goods and clapped forthwith into jail. Fancy that under such circumstances a man who had lived his 70 years, and had learned something from his own suffering and experience, something from the secretly imparted information of others, might not say a word to help his fellows. Is it not too absurd to contemplate without both tears and laughter that that man who should plead with his fellow men to abstain from habitually living on butter cakes and coffee should be charged with obscenity and imprisoned in consequence? And imagine some sapient post office official solemnly declaring that any discussion of digestion is obscene. Consider how the land would be flooded with literature describing the pleasures of gluttony and depicting impossible gastronomic feats. Consider, too, trying to cure indigestion and to suppress the orgies of our children in pies, crullers, fritters, and butter cakes by the naive device of forbidding all knowledge of the digestive function and making the utterance of the name of a digestive organ an obscenity punishable by fine and imprisonment. Digestion is a matter to be considered in the light of hygiene. So is sex. Digestion is not in itself either moral or immoral. Neither is sex. But there is the most hideous immorality in the ascription of obscenity to sex, sex function, or any phase of sex life. And this is the crime of Comstockery. It has reared an awful idol to which have been sacrificed the best of our youth, with hypocrisy the high priest, ignorance the creed, and pruriency the detective. Comstockery strikes at the very root of life. It forbids that we shall know how to live our best. It forbids that we shall know how to save our children from the perils we have so discreditably passed through. It raises barriers of false modesty between parents and children by branding the very science of life an obscenity. Owing to the shocking suggestions of Comstockery, all that relates to life is degraded into the gutter, and that which would be pure and sweet and wholesome in the home or in the school becomes filthy Comstockery on the snickering lips of ignorant playfellows. The wonder is that we have endured the nasty thing for so long a time. We have been boys and girls, and have gone from our parents to our schoolmates and playfellows for the information to which we are entitled by very reason of living. But, more than all, because of our need to live right. We all know the hideous untruths we were told because of Comstockery. We all know how much we had to unlearn, and how great the suffering mentally, how great the deterioration physically in the unlearning. We all know our unfitness for parentage at the time we entered it. Every man knows how the brothels kept open doors and beckoning inmates by the thousand for his undoing. And yet we endure it. Comstockery. It is such a subtly pervasive thing, this Comstockery. It steals in wherever it can and puts the taint of its own uncleanness on whatever it touches. Clothing becomes a matter of Comstockery. We do not always see it, but such is the fact. We do not wear clothing for convenience, but to cover our nakedness. You see, nakedness is obscene. Not in itself, but only in man. You may take a naked dog on the street, but not a naked human being. The summer previous to the last one was a very hot one in New York, and a poor wretch of a boy of 14 years of age, being on the top floor of a crowded tenement, was half crazed by the heat and the lack of fresh air, of which there was absolutely none in the closet in which he was trying to sleep. He ran down into the street nude at 2 o'clock in the morning in the hope of finding a surcease of his distress. A policeman saw him, remembered his blushing Comstockeryan time, and haled the poor lad off to a cell. The next morning the magistrate, in tones of grimmest virtue, sent the boy to the reformatory, remarking with appropriate jest that the young scoundrel might have 7 years in which to learn to keep his clothes on. Theodore Roosevelt, who is at once the greatest president and the wisest man of whom we have any record, tells us that we must breed more children. But how shall our women bear more children, or presently bear any, if they are to be continually made more and more unfit for motherhood by the pitfalls into which their ignorance of the science of life leads them? Because of the Comstockery which has its felt grip upon our throats, we may not instruct the little child in the way of health, or if it be said that there is nothing to prevent the parent from instructing the child, yet it must be insisted that the parent has no means of knowing, since Comstockery prescribes ignorance as the only way to innocence, and innocent our girls must be at any cost. Besides, the average mother, if she will but admit the truth, is ashamed to talk with her daughter about Comstockery things. We all know that this is so. Our parents treated us in such fashion, and we are so treating our children. The knowledge which each generation acquires at the cost of health, yes, at the cost of life even, dies with it for the most part. The one thing we most need to know is how to live. The science of life begins with sex, goes on with sex, ends with sex, but sex we may not discuss. Thus we go on in ignorance of life. Shall it remain so? Is Comstockery to be our best expression of the most vital matter of existence? Life, sex should be, and is, when we recognize it, the purest, sweetest, simplest subject of discussion, and we make of it a filthy jest. We will not tell our sons the things we have learned through bitter experience, because we cannot bear the shame of discussing sex subjects with them, because of the accursed Comstockery that is within us. But we will go to the club and the bar-room, or anywhere behind locked doors in the select company of our fellows, and there pour out the real essence of our Comstockery in stories which make a filthy jest of sex. Every man knows this is the truth. Perhaps women in their Comstockery know it too. As has been already said, treat digestion as sex is treated, and it will be sniggered over behind locked doors in precisely the same way. Let us rid ourselves of the fatal, prurient restrictions on sex discussion. And in a marvelously short time we shall have a store of sweet knowledge on the subject that will enable us to live well ourselves, and fit us to bring into the world such children as will amaze us with their health of body and purity of mind. No alteration of the facts of life is necessary, but only a change of attitude. Why, when Trilby brought the bare foot into prominence, it was gravely debated whether or not such an indecency should be permitted. It was assumed that a naked foot was indecent. Why a foot more than a hand? Why any one part of the body more than another? Comstockery! Comstockery! End of section 9. Recording by Bill Moseley, Llano County, Texas, USA.